If you're trying to live a brain healthy lifestyle and you're not paying attention to the quality of the air that you're breathing, you are taking one of the most important variables for your brain health off the table. And that is just not tenable for people living in the world in which air pollution is the norm for the vast majority of people in basically every country around the world.
Well, hey everybody, Dr. David Perlmutter here. Welcome again to the Empowering Neurologist. Here's the question. How are our environments affecting our brains? How are the things to which we are exposed affecting mechanisms like inflammation and metabolism of our brain cells? And how might things that we are exposed to put us at risk for some issues that we don't want to get close to, like cognitive decline and even depression? We're going to explore these ideas and what we can do about changing our environments to build a healthier brain with Dr. Austin Perlmutter. Let me tell you a little bit more about him. Austin Perlmutter, MD, is a board-certified internal medicine physician, New York Times bestselling author, published researcher, and international educator. His mission is to help people improve their health by targeting the biological basis of stuckness in our brains and bodies. His writings, presentations, podcasts, and online educational programs explore how environmental factors influence our cognitive and mental state and have reached millions. Dr. Perlmutter has been featured on PBS, Rolling Stone, MedPage Today, Newsweek, Medical News Today, NPR, and a wide range of other media outlets. He is a co-producer of Alzheimer's, the Science of Prevention series, and host of the Better Brain Blueprint series. Dr. Perlmutter currently serves as the managing director at Big Bold Health, a food as medicine company focused on helping people rejuvenate health through better immune function, where he is running a first-of-its-kind study exploring the effects of plant nutrients on human aging through epigenetic modulation. We are delighted to have Dr. Austin Perlmutter, who happens to be our son, on the podcast today, and I'm very excited to welcome him. Well, Austin Perlmutter, welcome to the podcast.
David Perlmutter, thanks for having me.
This is an interesting topic because, we talk all about diet and exercise and nature exposure, getting enough sleep. And I don't think we spend very much time talking about these hidden threats that you've really articulated in so many different forms of media that are really clear and present danger as it relates to the brain. And, ultimately, I think we're going to, later on in the program, see that they act through similar mechanisms that I think our audience is quite familiar with. But let's start by talking about how you got interested in the idea that things in our environment are threatening to our brains.
Right. Well, if you were to take a step back and ask, what is it that impacts our brains? There are a number of different ways that a person could look at this kind of equation, which is what goes in changes what goes out. And all of us are, to some extent, invested in what comes out, meaning what is our brain state at the end of the day? What is our cognition? What does our memory look like? What does our mood look like? So then we need to focus on what goes in. And one of the biggest revelations for me was a very straightforward observation, which is that modern day humans spend 90 to 95% of their day indoors. And that includes our vehicles, our offices, our homes, and if you're a younger person, your school. So that means that the majority of what is coming into our brains is happening indoors. And that means that if we really want to pay attention to what the inputs are that are influencing the outputs we care about, then we need to be paying attention to what we're consuming in those settings. And if you think about consumption, most people talk about, well, we're consuming food. And that is true. We're consuming food and water or other beverages, but we're also consuming or inhaling a ton of different data forms in the context of the air we breathe. We breathe something like 20,000 times a day. We're also intaking data through our skin. We're taking in data through our eyes and our ears. So I think that if we really want to be focusing on how we optimize brain health outcomes, we've got to be paying attention to all of this. And the domain that I've spent a lot of time more recently focused on is in particular what is coming in through our diet, through what we consume through our mouths in our homes, and what is coming in through the quality of the air that we breathe in our homes, offices, cars, and otherwise. Because while many people are aware that diet matters for brain health, you've done an excellent job describing that over the years. I don't think most people understand that the quality of the air they breathe is actually one of the most well understood variables that influences our risk for developing brain health conditions, ranging from Alzheimer's dementia to higher risk for depression to aggressive behavior, and even more trouble with test taking in children. So, all of that is to say, these are incredible opportunities for us to take back our brain health that can start in our homes, in our offices, in our cars. And I just love talking about this because so often when people hear this story, they say, I had no idea, and I'd love to make those changes.
Well, you're right. I think that most of us don't think about it because we don't feel, see, taste, smell any of this. And you used an interesting term earlier, data. You said we're actually inhaling data. And I think that you need to open that up a little bit. When you say that, tell me what you're trying to imply.
Sure. Well, considering what it is that we actually inhale, we often think about air being primarily nitrogen, some oxygen, some other trace gases. What we now understand is that air, every breath we take, is loaded with a wide variety of different data points in the context of particles, in the context of tiny microbial data points, in the context of various gases that are released from our environment. Why does all of that matter? Well, we know that these molecules and these various particles that are in our air can bind to and influence pathways throughout our bodies. And we now understand that one of the core pathways that is being influenced is what is happening within our brains. So often, you and other people on your podcast have talked about this incredible interface between inflammation and brain health, or metabolism and brain health, or even something like neurotransmitters and neuroplasticity and brain health. And that's really interesting as it relates to something like food. We know food influences our metabolism, food influences our immune state, food influences neuroplasticity, it becomes our neurotransmitters. But it is also the case that the air that we breathe is acting on each of those pathways by either augmenting or decreasing inflammation, by changing our metabolic state. We actually know that exposure to high levels of air pollution is a risk factor for weight gain. Why would that be the case? Well, it may be because of these pathways that directly act on metabolism. We also know that air pollution can change the way that our neurotransmitters function, in part through some of these immune and inflammatory pathways. Key point here being, these have historically been things that we've relegated to diet alone. And it turns out that the air we breathe is a major, major risk factor and influence on these cornerstone neurological pathways that relate to disease and health outcomes.
So I just want to let our viewers know that it's a great conversation that we're having. But when we wrap up, or towards the end of the podcast, we're going to really go through why, now that we understand why it's so meaningful and important, what we can do. I mean, that's really, I think, the empowerment part, the empowering neurologist. Okay, I get it. I get what you're talking about. Now, what do I do? But let's turn our attention to the kitchen. The kitchen can be a threat to us, or it can represent the epicenter of our wellness. So, what goes on in the kitchen, to start there, that you want to really unpack for us?
Right. Well, let's think about our kitchens as perhaps the single biggest opportunity for health, and perhaps one of the single biggest opportunities for issues with our health, especially as it relates to our brain health. We know that our modern day kitchens are kind of a cornerstone opportunity for us, but we appreciate now that roughly 8 or so out of the, I guess, 21 meals a week that we eat are being consumed in the home. There are some positive trends as far as people cooking more food in the last couple of years, but by and large, people tend not to really optimize for what they're preparing in their homes. And why that matters is because when we look at what is being served in restaurants, when we look at what is being consumed when people eat their meals out, we find a statistic that you know very well, which is that added sugars and highly processed foods make up the majority of the calories that people are consuming. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that just by cooking at home, we're going to bypass all of these issues. We know that roughly 73% of American food is ultra processed, and that includes the foods that are consumed in the home. We know that around 72% of foods that are found in the American grocery store contain added sugar and sweeteners. So, All of this is to say that there's one incredible advantage to being invested in what happens in the kitchen, and that is the opportunity to have more control over what it is that we consume, specifically from a food based perspective. As we look at correlations here between ultra processed food, and again, this can be what we find out in vending machines, in restaurants, or in our kitchens, some recent data suggested that about a 44% increased risk of developing dementia is correlated with an increased intake of these ultra processed foods. And so we see similar data around conditions like depression. That all tells us that we have this incredible opportunity, if we pay attention to what is in our kitchen, to dramatically reduce our risk factors for neurodegenerative diseases as well as mood disorders, based solely on paying attention to what we're stocking in our kitchen. And so, taking a step back, that means paying attention to what we put into our cart at the grocery store, but also thinking about when we make a meal in our kitchen, what are the ingredients that we can bring in that are either associated with better brain health or associated with worse brain health. So I actually think the kitchen is a cornerstone location as it relates to either promoting brain health or detracting from brain health. And it is perhaps the single best place in the house where we can reclaim our brain health, because this is the opportunity to make a decision with what we have to do each day. We've got to eat a few times each day, depending on your meal plan, I suppose, to actually optimize for the things that are going to protect our brains and enhance our brain function today and for the rest of our lives.
Right now I'm kind of mentally juxtaposing my medical training, your medical training, and the notion that health begins in the kitchen. I mean, they're so disparate. There's nothing in our medical training that got us ready for this, and yet this is, this and sleep and exercise, the most important legs of the stool, and yet, incredibly, no one's talking about it in medical education. I find that to this day. I've been saying it for an awful long time. Let me get back to the notion of environmental threats, and let's go to the kitchen if we can, because I recall seeing you on a news program one time talking about how we cook, and you raised a lot of concerns about cooking with gas, which is very, very popular. I mean, now we're seeing, more electric techniques with induction, et cetera, but you really called out the notion of cooking with gas. So what's the story with that?
Right. Well, one of the most interesting things that I have learned in the last couple of years is that it is not just about the food in the kitchen as it relates to risk for brain health. And what I'm about to say has been controversial. It's somehow become a political conversation rather than a scientific
What
conversation, but
else is new,
it relates
right?
specifically to the quality of the air we're breathing in our kitchens and by and large in our homes. It turns out that one of the most important sources of indoor air pollution is actually basically cooking, right? And if you were to look at other countries that are using solid fuel sources, you would see that air pollution levels are dramatically higher than what we might see in the United States. But it is true that the way that we cook is a major contributor to our air pollution in our kitchens and in our homes. So let me break down why that matters. When we generally look at the research around air pollution and cognitive health, we have seen an absolute explosion in recent research suggesting that air pollution directly correlates with worse brain health. That is a incredibly important variable for all of us to pay attention to. Now, in the United States, we're seeing a pretty significant uptick in pollution, specifically from wildfire smoke. And so you're seeing the news coverage talking a lot about why we should close our windows, use air purifiers in the context of these wildfires, especially in places like the Pacific Northwest where I live. But the reality is that just like the food that we eat, the majority of the exposure most people are getting for air pollution is happening in our homes. And why that matters is because we have agency over, we have control over the air pollutants that we're generating in our homes. As a quick primer on this, there are a number of different air pollutants. You have particulate matter, you have gases like carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitric oxides, and then you have volatile organic compounds like benzene and toluene, as well as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons like bisphenol. But when we look at air pollution and the correlations with worse brain health in particular, what we see is that it is the particulate matter, the PMs, that are most strongly correlated with negative health outcomes. Now, let's bring this back to what happens in the kitchen. If you are cooking on your stove and you're generating smoke, you are generating air pollution. You can't completely avoid this, nor should we be trying to, but we do need to be thinking about how to ventilate that air pollution.
Good point.
Beyond this, however, different types of stoves produce different types of air pollution. And when we look in particular at the most common types of cooktops in the United States, we see there's gas, electric, and induction, which is a newer form of cooktop. Gas stoves, because of the way that that gas is being used, because of the leakage of the gas and the molecules formed by combustion of that gas, does actually produce more air pollution, specifically benzene, than you get from an electric stove and certainly from an induction cooktop. So the debate, the argument was whether gas stoves were contributing to worse health, and it was looking at some of these molecules like benzene, which have been strongly associated with risk for developing asthma. Now, I'm not a pulmonologist, but I do spend a lot of time trying to think about how the pathways that are activated by air pollution can lead to overall worse health, including brain health. And it turns out that many of these pathways that have been linked to respiratory symptoms coming from gas stoves are relevant for the brain. All of this isn't to say that I'm telling you to get rid of your gas cooktop and immediately move to an induction cooktop. That's not feasible for a lot of people. But I do think we need to be talking about, as this very specific part of our kitchen, which is how we cook, we should be cooking, how we can decrease the exposure to some of these air pollutants that have been linked to worse brain health. So, just to give people a couple of really important things they can do, ventilation is key. So it's not just the generation of the pollution, but rather how you get rid of the pollution that matters. So that means using your hood. If you have a hood, that means opening the windows if you have windows nearby. And it also means being cautious of not cooking foods that are going to create a ton of smoke and additional air pollution. So in order here, I think induction is actually the best if you can afford it. It's not necessarily the thing that all chefs enjoy. And personally, I also enjoy gas stoves for their cooking. I think electric is also really good. Again, doesn't necessarily have the cooking ability that some people like for a gas stove. But if you do have a gas stove, ventilation is really the key.
So in other words, don't cook on your gas stove unless you have the hood going. And, I've actually seen hoods that ventilate right back into the room. I mean, I don't
It's it,
understand the sense of that.
it's a really good point. There are a ton of different ways that you can ventilate a stove. So you can have a hood that goes above the stove that pulls the air up. You can have one that goes in the stove that pulls the air down, or you can just have something that circulates it locally. In a perfect world, your ventilation is basically sucking out the air pollution and venting it outside of the home. Again, this isn't always accessible to people. So the goal here is to kind of do what you can. One thing that you could consider doing is having an air purifier in your kitchen that you're running if and when you're using this gas stove. With that said, to be aware that the air purifiers, specifically these HEPA purifiers, will pull out the particulate matter. But if your goal is to remove some of those volatile organic compounds, including benzene, you need an activated carbon filter, which is able to trap those VOCs.
Hmm. Well, you mentioned the particulates, and many people have heard of these so-called PM 2.5s. They're getting a lot of press. They're related to inflammation in the body in various forms, including in the lungs, and even relationships of exposure to these particles, PM 2.5s, to risk for cognitive decline. One study out of Toronto, I think you and I have talked about it before, where the proximity that you lived with respect to a busy highway had to do with your risk for cognitive decline. But that said, I think a lot of people, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, kind of think that, oh, a forest fire, that's like being at a camping. Camping, it's wood and nothing's really wrong with it. And why shouldn't bust out the marshmallows for crying out loud? But the reality is that smoke has got a lot of stuff in it that when homes are burned up and other things are burned up that are not part of the forest, that becomes very, very threatening. And to be fair, calling it like it's going to be, things are going to be a lot worse moving forward as far as fires. I mean, that seems pretty obvious.
I think that's true. And I would come back to this point, which I think is so important. It is true that being exposed to air pollution is damaging to our health, and it seems to be especially damaging to brain health. But what I really love about the air pollution story, even compared to something like exercise, we all know exercise is good for us. We should be exercising more. Is that with air pollution, there are things that we can do that are passive that will dramatically decrease our exposure. So, yes, let's talk a little bit about these kind of large scale data points. And this is really just the last couple of years. What we've seen is many of the most prestigious journals around the world publishing research showing that air pollution exposure directly relates to risk of brain health issues, both depression and dementia. So, just to give you an example, in August of 2023, a study came out called Comparison to Particulate Air Pollution from Different Emission Sources and Incident Dementia in the United States. They looked at about 28,000 people age 50 or older. They tracked them for 10 years, and they found that when there was more exposure to PM 2.5s, and these are some of the smallest particulates that are able to actually penetrate through your lungs and get into your bloodstream and amp up inflammation in your body, that when there was more exposure to these PM 2.5s from agriculture, traffic, coal combustion, and wildfire smoke in particular, that there was a higher risk in basically people being diagnosed with dementia. And that really kind of adds to the research, again, that's been published just in the last couple of years, including a study that looked at the available research. So this was a systematic review and meta-analysis looking at 92 million people. And they found that for every increase in air pollution exposure of one very small amount, basically 1 part per cubic meter, they found that it went up by 3%. So in this case, what they're saying is when air pollution goes up, risk for dementia goes up, and in a dramatic and linear fashion. That tells us something, and it helps us to understand why the Lancet and other bodies have basically declared that air pollution is a major risk factor for dementia. It's probably through metabolic pathways. It's probably through oxidative stress. It's probably through inflammation. Those pathways are interesting, and we can talk about maybe how you can offset this by taking other lifestyle changes that can help to decrease inflammation, metabolic dysfunction. But the fundamental point here for people to understand is if you're trying to live a brain healthy lifestyle and you're not paying attention to the quality of the air that you're breathing, you are taking one of the most important variables for your brain health off the table. And that is just not tenable for people living in the world in which air pollution is the norm for the vast majority of people in
Mhm.
basically every country around the world.
And especially getting back to cooking in third world countries where they are cooking with solid fuels like coal or wood indoors. I mean, that's just setting the stage for disaster. I did a post a while back where I have a meter to measure indoor air pollution, specifically the PM 2.5s in the green zone in our house, fortunately. And then I vacuumed. I started and while I was using the vacuum cleaner in my hand, I had the meter in the other hand. That thing went off the chart. And so, yeah, the vacuum cleaner has a HEPA filter within it, but still, there's a lot that gets out. So, this notion of HEPA filters, we're hearing a lot about that. That's a pretty effective way with it, at least with respect to the 2.5s.
It is. And in essence, the HEPA filter's ability to capture small particulates, which is what it's best for, increases along with the number of HEPA. So, for example, a HEPA 13 is better than a HEPA 12. A HEPA 14, which is kind of the best on the market right now, captures about 3 times the amount of small particles at the very end of the spectrum as a HEPA 13 filter. But I do want to come back to a point that you had just made, which was vacuuming is actually an intense source of air pollution. And
Yeah.
I feel like we're still at the early stages of education on this topic. When we talk about food, there's a pretty solid consensus that added sugar is something we should all avoid. Whether you're conventional medicine or integrated medicine, everyone agrees there's not a lot of value, not a lot of benefit from added sugar. And then when you get outside of the realm of added sugar, then there starts to be a debate over other nutrients. But when we talk about air pollution in the home, I don't think that there is even a remote consensus as to people's understanding of what we need to be avoiding. So, certainly, cooking is an important variable. Vacuuming, yes, is an important variable. We don't think about this. We think we're cleaning up the home, we're doing
Yeah.
something good for ourselves. But it is a testament to the point that if you are going to vacuum, 2 things. One is use a vacuum with a good filter system, ideally a HEPA filter, and don't empty your vacuum cleaner in your home. It is amazing how much dust is
Wow,
released
that's
when
a
you try to
very,
dump it.
very good point.
Well,
And
I
I'm
was
guilty.
guilty of this for many years, but then I
I am guilty. I'm
realized,
so glad you told me. Why were you waiting to tell your dad this information?
well, you gotta save something for the podcast.
That's
But
true.
just to get
I
into
need
this
to
in a little bit
podcast with
more,
you more often.
So let's talk about some of the actual hidden sources of indoor air pollution that most people
Sure.
are not aware of. So smoking, I would say we start there. We know that smoking cigarettes, smoking cigars, that's air pollution. We know that it's dangerous. We know that it's bad for our hearts. We know it's bad for our brains, increases risk of stroke. Fine. But really be thinking about smoking, not just as a reflection of smoking cigarettes, but rather if you see smoke inside your home, you are generating air pollution. And something I've been talking about a lot lately that is going to make a couple of people, maybe more than that, upset, ruffle some feathers, is that one of the most concentrated sources of indoor air pollution when we choose to use it is incense. So we're going to get into this here in a moment because I think that's something that many people might challenge, but appreciate that anything that generates smoke is a source of air pollution. Incense is a concentrated source of air pollution. It's been used for millennia. It's made out of these aromatic resins that come from plants. And the reason plants make these molecules is it helps to defend them against bugs, to heal after injury. But people for thousands of years have been collecting these resins from plants, and they roll them up or they pack them and they create these various products. There are a ton of different formats for incense. Popular forms, you can get it sandalwood, frankincense. Palo Santo is a really important one that many people use.
Lignum
But
vitae. Yes.
right. So there are tons of different forms of this, but modern day incense is basically around 21% of these herbals, these wood powders, and then about 33% bamboo sticks and 35% fragrance materials, and then adhesive powder that keeps it all together. Point for people to understand is that incense exposure is a concentrated source of PM 2.5s and other air pollutants. And that in one study that was published in Nature Scientific Reports in the year 2020, over 3 years, people who had higher exposure to indoor incense had substantial decreases in cognitive ability across a variety of different areas. And they had also generally problems with brain connectivity in multiple regions, but specifically one region was the default mode network. So what this is saying is people with more exposure to indoor incense had a number of negative changes in how their brains functioned, both in terms of kind of some metrics of cognition and in terms of how their brains function in terms of looking at connectivity. And that's really interesting. And when you couple that with data showing that, for example, in pregnant women, higher incense exposure correlates with a 51% higher risk for depression, you start to get
Wow.
a little bit concerned. And so when I jumped into this and I said, well, is there a mechanism? Is it just that maybe there's some sort of a confounder here? Well, burning incense, at least based on certain studies, has been shown to produce up to 400% more particulate matter, including these PM 2.5s, than cigarettes per gram burned. That's really profound because we talk at length about why you should cut back on cigarette smoking or quit cigarette smoking, why secondhand smoking is so bad for us. And yet we use incense often as part of a wellness practice when exactly the opposite is happening as it relates to our health. So this is something everybody really needs to know. And again, just like the gas stove, I'm not going to be up here saying you can't use a gas stove, you can't burn incense, but you do need to be thinking about it as a risk factor.
Well, hi everyone, Dr. David Perlmutter here. We hope you're enjoying this content, and if you would do so, go ahead and hit the like button. And if you're not already a subscriber to our channel, please consider doing so. We're really grateful to have you as part of our community, so let's get right back to the presentation. How effective are N95 masks
Well, an N95,
in the context of these particles?
right. This is a conversation that was very popular a couple years back during the context of the pandemic, related to viral molecules or viral particles. But in the context of PMs, the N95 can actually be very effective. The downside here is you have to have a well-fitting N95, and I think that's the key. So if you're somebody like me who has a lot of facial hair, I've gone into the test booth, put on the N95, and I have found, which is unfortunate, is it doesn't seal because it doesn't get a good seal around that facial hair.
Right.
Similarly, if you pack one into your backpack that's been there for a couple years and you try to unfold it and it's all bent, it probably isn't going to work that well. I do think in the context of, for example, significant wildfire smoke outside, that it's not a bad idea. And these are things that can and do work. The issue here, though, is inside the home, it is untenable, obviously, to be wearing an N95. So that's why paying attention to the sources of air pollution that are optional, specifically what's happening in the home, I think is a much better solution than worrying about how to decrease your exposure with an N95.
Yeah, but I would say that I could see myself wearing an N95 while I'm vacuuming. I vacuum, as you know, not
A good
yeah, I
deal.
vacuum quite a bit, and I could see putting on an N95 for that. Now that I test it and I see, and this is the kind of vacuum cleaner we have, and it has a
Right.
HEPA filter on it.
Right.
Can't talk about the brand, but this is supposed to be a non-polluting vacuum cleaner, and this thing went right off the chart as expected. And the other thing, again, take home point is we all emptied, well, not we all, but I emptied the vacuum stuff in the kitchen garbage can until today, until speaking to you. That's huge because I see
Yeah.
the dust. I see the dust come up, and I know that's going to float in the atmosphere. But I think it's laziness. But I could definitely envision putting on now that I know what I know, N95 while I'm vacuuming. There's nothing wrong with that.
I think you're right. And it's very interesting when you start to use an indoor air quality meter to see what it is that you're doing that is generating high levels of air pollution. So, another thing that many people are not aware of, but when you test it, you'll be shocked, is what candles do to indoor air quality. And so, these are all little things, these subtle things that we don't pay attention to. But I want to come back to the key kind of outcome data here, which is why it all matters, which is air pollution exposure, specifically PM 2.5 exposure, is one of the strongest risk factors for risk of dementia and now understood to dramatically enhance risk, at least in these observational studies, of depression. That's really important because it means that there is a risk factor within our control that, if we work on it, can potentially dramatically reduce our risk for cognitive decline and potentially reduce our risk for developing depression. And then we say, well, where are we being exposed? The majority of your exposure is inside your home, and it is coming from things that you think are okay. So this is kind of where we were maybe decades ago as it related to food. It was, oh well, for the most part, it's a calories equation, so don't worry too much about the individual foods that you're eating. Then we pivoted and said, well, it's the fat that we need to worry about. And then we decided to give sugar a nice pass, and people ate a ton of added sugar, and all of these health conditions went up because the correlation between added sugar consumption and risk for metabolic diseases and risk for inflammatory diseases just wasn't what was discussed. And now we finally understand, I wouldn't say finally, but now there is a public understanding that the added sugar in our kitchen is a major risk factor for developing dementia, for developing depression, for generally having worse health. So we'd say, well, that's something I can do something about. And what I think is, we are several decades away from what we're discussing right now being generalized and understood, even though many of the kind of most validated scientific bodies around the world have been talking about this. I think the problem in part is that people just haven't become aware of the significance of what we're discussing here. And also, unfortunately, there is a massive market around things that we put in our homes that enhance our air pollution, that we are being sold as somehow healthy and somehow enhancing wellness. And some great examples here would be, again, incense used for wellness practices, scented candles, incredibly popular. You bring them into your home so you can have the fall scent. Well, it turns out that scent is chemicals that may damage our brain health, and that candles can produce a ton of PM 2.5s themselves. A number of the different kind of chemicals that we use for cleaning in our homes can release high levels of volatile organic compounds, some of which may be risky for our health. And so, if we're paying attention to the exposome, all those different things that we're being exposed to in a given day, it's true you're going to eat probably multiple times a day, but you're going to be breathing perpetually. And that means that every breath is a vote for or against good brain health. And the worst part of this whole thing, I'll just reiterate because I think it is so poignant, is that the majority of the stuff that is damaging our brain health as it relates to the quality of our air is stuff that we are purposely or unconsciously bringing into our house, often under the illusion that it's actually good for our wellness. It's marketed as green, it's marketed as organic. And before you know it, you have a bunch of incense sticks, you have a bunch of potpourri, you have a bunch of scented candles. You're using these chemicals that are increasing VOCs in your atmosphere, and you don't understand that so much of what you've just done is exactly antithetical to your outcomes. So I think this is a message that everybody needs to hear, again, because so much of what we can do to reclaim good brain health is passive, simply by decreasing our exposure to these molecules in our atmosphere.
Well, that's the empowering part. There are days now in various states where they used to be called snow days, where the kids would have to stay indoors or not go to school. Now they're fire days when there's so much smoke in the atmosphere. But at that point, it's there's a lot of smoke in the atmosphere. I mean, there are apps where you can measure that. But I think it's clear that even at lower levels, this is a clear and present danger. I want to one other observation: get in just about any Uber and there's that
Mm.
little pine Christmas tree hanging from the rearview mirror that smells. It smells awful to me because I know it's bad for me. But I guess they do it to smell good for whatever reason. But that's bad stuff, isn't it?
It's such a good point you brought up. And we've all been in the Uber, the taxi, the vehicle where there's the little dangly Christmas tree that's the pine tree that's on the rearview mirror. And, you go to a car wash, they hand those things out. And this is, again, what really gets me about it is that this whole industry has been wrapped up in this idea of purity and cleanliness, which is if your teenage kid smells really bad, you just get this chemical spray and douse it down, right? Or if you're in the car and you haven't changed out your car's air filter for the last 10 years, that you should just put this little Christmas tree there and it's going to smell like pine. And now all of a sudden, your car is a pleasant space and people are going to feel better because it smells like it's clean. There is some really important underlying research around sensitivity to these fragrances, and that extends from the air fresheners to cologne and perfume. I was recently in a department store 2 days ago, and you walk in, and those perfumes, that whole section is overwhelming. And people like me would say, oh, well, I'm just maybe sensitive to it. But some people have incredible sensitivity to these types of things. And I guess I might put myself in that bucket because when I walk into an Airbnb or a hotel and they've used these fragrances, my eyes start to water, my eyes get itchy. I feel like I have a bit more trouble breathing. I feel like I don't think as well. And it turns out that that's not unique. It turns out that around 17% or so people report health issues specifically from air fresheners, with about a third of those people reporting neurological symptoms like migraines coming from them. And there was a study, this really amazing study that spoke directly to this. And okay, just as a quick background, air fresheners and scents that we put into our
Fresheners.
homes, they're packed with these volatile organic compounds. VOCs aren't necessarily bad. There are some of them that have actually been linked to health benefits, but many of the VOCs in these products are unregulated, and some of these have been explicitly linked to worse health outcomes. So when we look at what happens when we're in a room that has higher levels of these indoor VOCs versus having, I guess, an unscented room with better ventilation, they did this study where they looked at office workers and they looked at what happened when they basically increased the VOCs in the office or had it be greener, where they actually were not exposing people to these molecules. And they found that people who were exposed to higher levels of VOCs had dramatically lower cognitive scores. So this is really important stuff. And this, we could talk about the sensitivity. Many people experience a whole range of symptoms when they're exposed to these VOCs or to these air fresheners or other sources of VOCs. But going back to your reference point here about the taxis or the Uber drivers, um, these products, anything air freshener related, is almost completely unregulated as it relates to what molecules are going into that product. And so we're in essence just creating this super concentrated source of air pollution that we're purposely putting in our very small places like vehicles and breathing it in perpetually. So, my advocacy on this would be to say that we need a system where we can opt for or against being in vehicles and being in hotels
Right.
and
You can opt for or
Airbnbs.
against conversation. You should be able to say, air freshener or whatever they
I
want to
think it
call
is
it.
completely reasonable because so many people have
I
sensitivity.
know that the Uber drivers don't like that, but I open the window on both sides in the back seat. I know, and I think it helps because I don't smell it when I do that. So, let me go back to one other thing that you had mentioned, and that is, we know we have an air filter in the engine, but there is an air filter for the cabin. I mean, I guess a lot of people know that. I didn't know that until quite recently when I took your sister's car to have some service, and he said, "When did you change the air filter for the
Mm.
cabin?" And I I didn't feel very intelligent at that point. He said, it's behind the glove compartment, or I don't know if you even call it that anymore. But so he found this trap door behind the glove compartment. There he pulled out this filter that was filthy. And that's what's filtering the air that you're breathing in the car when you have the air conditioner on. Now, for viewers who knew this, I apologize. I did not know this, but we changed it and I was happy. But I mean, there's a bit of news there, I think. I don't know that everybody knew about this. I kind of last to the party on that one.
I think you're speaking to a much larger theme, which is any space that you occupy indoors, that is, should be having filtration, should be having ventilation, and the filters in particular should be replaced with a relatively high cadence. So if you have an HVAC in your home, you should be looking to replace those filters every few months. And I think that there's a visual here that people will understand, which is what do these filters look like when you take them out? I
Yeah.
mean, it may be the case that when you take the filter out of your car or when you take the filter out of your HVAC or out of your HEPA purifier, that it's still very clean. But I will say that by and large, that is so unlikely. And it is absolutely shocking most of the time that after just a few months, you'll find these things are completely opaque and black and gray. And it just speaks to what is filtering and what is floating around in your home. I think the car is such a great example. I mean, especially if you're spending a lot of time on the highway and other places where there's a lot of air pollution around you, that filter is the best thing that you have available to help decrease your exposure to these molecules. We actually know that some of the highest sources of air pollution are around traffic, to the point where traffic related air pollution, or TRAP, has been a consistently studied variable as it relates to worse brain health. And some of the research that I know you and I have discussed in the past is that higher exposure to this traffic related air pollution actually is related to things like violent crime and impulsive crime and worse test taking. And so, absolutely, if we're spending time on the highway or if we happen to live near a highway, that is an additional variable that we have to be keeping in mind. And it just speaks more to what are the systems in our cars, in our homes, that are capable of filtering out some of those particulates.
Yeah, you and I explored that in Brainwash, the notion of interrupting prefrontal cortex input that in terms of decision making and behavior via inflammation leads to issues related to mood, et cetera, et cetera. And this is as inflammatory as the foods we eat or the sleep we didn't get the night before or lack of exercise, et cetera. It's just as inflammatory, if not more so. I want to go back to just this notion for a moment on these filters. And, you mentioned that there are the gradations or the qualifications of the HEPA filters on home air purifiers, and that we are anticipating soon that they're going to take it up another notch. So I think you said level 14, which is my understanding is that's significantly more effective. So will we see that soon? This quality of air purifier?
Sure. Well, you can already find them in a few, and I would say, as much as it's good to get the best level of air purifier possible as far as the filtration system, the goal is to get something and start cleaning your air. And as it relates to HVACs, these are ranked by MERV, not HEPA. And the higher the HEPA or MERV, the more kind of blockage there is over the air because it's pulling it through a more smaller filters. So that can sometimes be a limitation. So if you have a weak air purifier and you try to put a HEPA 14 filter in there, it just won't pull the air through that filter. So the bottom line here would be to say, yes, the higher the better as it relates to MERV and to HEPA. But if you're just thinking about this now and you have, your home air filtration system, go see what you're using now. See if you can put in a higher MERV filter, but maybe more importantly, make sure you're changing that regularly. And I think this is kind of the bottom line to all of this, which is to say, this is a pretty simple physics equation, right? What we're talking about here is that there are particles in the air, as well as gases, but mostly as it relates to the negative health effects, we're talking about particles. So your goal here is to decrease the amount of particles generated in your local environment and to increase the kind of pulling out of the atmosphere of these particles. So it combines these two things. It says, what do we do to generate less of these particles? We covered a couple of these things. So it would be being cautious with your indoor cooking, being cautious with your vacuum cleaners. It would be decreasing your incense or potentially eliminating your indoor incense. If you do choose to use incense inside, I'd say keep your windows open, maybe use an air purifier, decrease the amount of incense you're burning. Scented candles, I want to come back to that one because scented candle exposure is most of the time marketed within this general kind of sense of, okay, this is a wellness intervention. And the reality is that scented candles actually produce a whole lot more of some of these chemicals that are linked to worse brain health. There was a study, specifically a study that looked at exposure to particulate matter. This was in Nature's reports in 2019, and they found that people's cognitive function basically dropped off as a reflection of how much candle air pollution they were inhaling. So, quick tip on this would be, if you're going to use a candle in your home, again, limit the total amount of exposure, but go for unscented first. Beeswax may be best in terms of what it's made of, but paraffin wax, which is the typical, is actually made from petroleum, and it may be the most concerning as relates to the chemicals that it produces. And to make sure that your wick isn't really long, because a long wick will sputter and that actually generates
Right.
more air pollution. But point here being, you need to look out for the things in your home that are contributing to air pollution and increase the amount that you're pulling it out. So there are a lot of simple steps that we can all take. This isn't some sort of proprietary information. What we're basically saying here is, you've been misled in terms of understanding the real risk to your brain health in your home, because so many of the products that we bring in that we're thinking are for our wellness are actually increasing air pollution. There are better alternatives, and we can do a better job removing some of those concerns.
Well, yeah, and beyond that, I think that beyond being misled, that we didn't really know a lot of this stuff back in the day. We always thought, well, sitting by the fireplace and having it crackle and the smoke would get into the room. How great was that? And one of the things I mentioned is there seems to be a move away from candles to using this lantern fuel thing with the wick, the clear glass with the lantern
Sure.
fuel in it. I can't imagine that's necessarily a good pivot.
Well, pros and cons to all of these things, because another form of, for example, the air freshener is the plug-in, right, that you put into the
Oh yeah.
wall and it just steady state releases these chemicals. So when we're talking about what's actually being produced by anything that's burning in your home, and that's not the air fresheners, that's different, but when we're talking about different forms of kind of candles, um, there are these multiple variables. And probably the most concerning of these variables is always going to be this question of, is it producing smoke? If it's producing smoke, it's something we need to worry about. Then you get to all of these other gases and particles that might be produced by these candles. But first step, I would say, is if you see smoke in your house, realize that's something you want to decrease exposure to. Doesn't mean you can't have an indoor fireplace and all that other stuff. But I think we're going to get to the point where actually measuring the amount of air pollution generated by a fireplace, for example. We have a propane fireplace. I've been testing it to see how much is it actually off-gassing or producing some of these harmful molecules. Seems like not a lot, but if you have a
Well, you have a
wood-burning
glass
fireplace,
front to that, though, right?
that's correct. And so I think there's a big difference between that and, for example, a wood burning fireplace that's poorly ventilated. All of this is to say, there's no blanket statement that I'm going to tell people you have to stop doing what you're doing. But I do think it's just like diet. If you want to eat added sugar, you should understand that if you continue to do that, you're going to be at a higher risk for developing the majority of brain conditions that are afflicting people today. Similarly, if you're going to burn a bunch of candles in your home, you should know there's a potential trade-off. It might be enjoyable for you tonight, but long term may actually increase your risk for dementia.
Yeah. This is, untapped resource, meaning, people have not talked about it. It's really valuable. And I think what you've done is you've really given us some, really user-friendly kinds of things to do. And I think we're all going to be looking at our, what we're doing in the house in a different way. And I would also say maybe this is a call for us to voice to the rideshare, companies that we'd like that option. And we don't want to be threatened by this, the pollution that they put inside their cars. You get the look when you open the window, but that stuff's got to be bad for you. And I think if we could opt out, you could opt out of conversation. If we could opt out, but then again, what are you going to do? Throw away the little Christmas tree, and then still the car is going to smell.
Just put it in the glove compartment. That's
Yeah,
my request for them.
you do that.
I haven't, because I haven't had anybody in the last year or so with one of the danglies. But
Dangly.
if and when it happens, that's my plan.
Okay, well, I hope that works out for you and you don't get dropped off on a corner somewhere in the middle of the night. Well, listen, Austin, I know you have another interview. Thank you for, thanks for everything that you do. And and for joining all of our people today. Great information, and we didn't know this, so I'm sure that there's much more coming from you in this realm. There's not a lot of experts out there that are talking about this kind of stuff.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on. Just a chance to talk to my dad, always a nice thing, but to talk about something that hopefully can substantially improve health for people. And let me just say, kind of my spiel as far as the advocacy here. We have heard in the last decades, and incredibly important, about the value of eating the right types of food to protect our brain health. And we've heard about the value of exercising to prevent risk for dementia and other brain disorders. And we've heard about why being mindful is important. Um, I think this is the new frontier because what makes air pollution and what makes the air quality such an important variable is that we don't have the ability necessarily to detect how significant it is. When we think about food, we have to actually pay attention to consume that food. So we'll be aware, for example, if we ate healthy food the day before, or if we went to a drive-through restaurant and ate a whole bunch of junk food. We'll know if we exercise. We can feel that. And we'll know if we spent the 20 minutes on the couch trying to meditate, because often it's really unpleasant. But the air that we breathe is so often below the surface of our conscious awareness as it relates to what's in it and the health impact that it's having. And I think that this is such an amazing opportunity for people because the steps that we can take to improve our air quality and therefore improve our brain health are largely passive things, meaning
Yeah.
they're not going to be unpleasant. You don't have to wake up at 5 a.m. to get to the gym to make this happen. You don't necessarily have to spend a ton of money to get access to a lot of these resources, because all that we're saying is, if you start paying attention to how you're generating air pollution and start paying attention to how you can remove it from your environment, that may be one of the single best ways to live a longer life, potentially lose weight, improve cardiovascular health, and in the context of what you and I are so interested in, enhance mood and decrease risk for dementia while improving short-term cognition. So this is really powerful stuff.
Well, Austin, thanks again, and I know I'll be seeing you soon. So, really looking forward to that. We're gonna have a great time.
Fantastic. And if anybody wants to learn more about any of these things, I do talk about this a lot on my newsletter, which is at my website, austinperlmutter.com.
AustinPerlmutter.com. Hopefully, there'll be a graphic right there at the bottom of the screen. And all the best. See you soon.
Talk soon.
Well, Dr. Austin Perlmutter really gave us a lot of information today. And it turns out that, the environments in which we find ourselves are hugely influential in determining the fate, the destiny of our brains. Are we going down the path of cognitive decline, depression, other brain related issues, or can we make changes in our environments to really architect a healthier brain? Thank you for joining me today, and thank you to Dr. Austin Perlmutter as well for joining us. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter here on The Empowering Neurologist. We will be back soon. Bye for now.